For 3,000 years, the HFY detention facility has housed the universe's most dangerous criminals. Built into the heart of a dead star, it was designed to contain beings whose very existence threatened galactic peace. The Zephyrian war criminals who could manipulate gravity. The Nethic assassins who phased through matter itself. The Vorthan psychics who could shatter minds with a thought. But, when a single human arrives in shackles, the alien guards dismiss him as just another primitive species from the galaxy's outer rim. After all, humans have no natural weapons, no telepathic abilities, no extraordinary physical capabilities. What threat could one small, fragile creature possibly pose to a facility that has never seen a single escape attempt succeed? They're about to discover that humanity's greatest weapon isn't strength, speed, or supernatural powers. It's something far more dangerous than any alien race has ever possessed. It's the refusal to accept that something is impossible. And, in the depths of the galaxy's most secure prison, one human is about to prove that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the species that once looked at the stars and decided they belong to them. The wardens think they've captured a prisoner. They have no idea they've just enrolled in humanity's first masterclass on what it truly means to be free. Marcus Chen had been awake for 47 hours when the transport ship finally docked at HFY Station. The neural dampeners they'd strapped to his skull made thinking feel like swimming through thick mud, but he'd learned to work around that particular inconvenience during his 3 weeks in custody. The trick was to let his mind wander while keeping one small part of it sharp and focused, like maintaining a candle flame in a hurricane. The guards who escorted him off the transport were HFY themselves, tall insectoid beings with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting in thousands of tiny rainbows. They moved with the confident efficiency of creatures who had never encountered a problem their natural advantages couldn't handle. Marcus counted 8 of them in the corridor, all armed with neural disruptors that could scramble a brain from 30 meters away. Subject designation Human 77 Alpha, announced the lead guard in the clicking, chittering language of the HFY. The universal translator implanted behind Marcus's ear converted the sounds into flat, emotionless English. Sentenced to indefinite containment for acts of terrorism against the Galactic Trade Consortium. Marcus almost smiled at that. Terrorism. They made it sound so dramatic. In reality, he'd simply figured out how to hack their quantum encryption protocols and had redistributed about 40 billion credits from consortium accounts to refugee relief organizations across 12 systems. The fact that this had caused 3 consortium member worlds to withdraw from the alliance was apparently beside the point. The processing station stretched before them like the mouth of some enormous beast. Marcus had spent years studying alien architecture during his work with the Earth Defense Corps, and HFY design philosophy still impressed him. Everything was built to accommodate species with wildly different physiological requirements. Corridors tall enough for the 15-foot Nethic, gravity adjustment fields for the low-mass Vorthan, atmospheric processors that could cycle through a dozen different gas mixtures in minutes. It was engineering on a scale that humanity was still decades away from matching. What struck him most, however, was how clean everything was. The walls were polished to a mirror shine, the air smelled of industrial disinfectants, and every surface was marked with precise geometric patterns that seemed to serve both aesthetic and functional purposes. This wasn't just a prison. It was a statement. A declaration that the civilized galaxy had achieved such technological mastery that even their detention facilities were works of art. Impressive, Marcus said aloud, knowing the guards would hear the translation. Though I have to ask, do you actually need all this security for what amounts to a fancy holding cell? The lead guard's compound eyes swiveled to focus on him. The human speaks. We were informed your species had developed rudimentary language skills. Rudimentary. Marcus tested the word, rolling it around in his mouth like a fine wine. That's fair. We only invented writing about 5,000 years ago. Practically yesterday by galactic standards. 5,000 standard cycles is indeed recent, agreed the guard with what might have been condescension. The HFY have maintained written records for over 2 million cycles. Our civilization achieved interstellar travel when your world was still dominated by primitive reptiles. And, yet, Marcus observed as they passed through a security checkpoint that scanned him with 12 different types of energy, here we are, having this conversation as equals. The guard made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter, though it sounded more like grinding metal.
Equals? Human, you are a prisoner. A specimen to be contained and studied. Your species has existed for perhaps a fraction of our recorded history. You have mastered perhaps 1% of the technologies we consider basic. In what possible sense could we be equals?
Marcus was quiet for a moment as they entered a vast chamber filled with processing stations.
Dozens of aliens moved through the space, some clearly prisoners, others guards or administrators. He recognized a few species from his xenobiology training.
The massive, elephant-like Terralians with their 3 trunks and natural armor plating. The ethereal Vorthan floating in personal gravity fields, their translucent bodies pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. The wolf-like Phanari with their pack-bond telepathy and enhanced reflexes. All of them gave him curious looks as he passed. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, having made first contact only 15 years ago.
Most aliens had never seen one in person.
Marcus suspected he was probably the first human ever to be processed through HFY, which made him something of a historical footnote. He wondered if they'd put a plaque up somewhere.
Equality, Marcus said finally, isn't about age or technology or any of that. It's about potential. About what someone might accomplish given the opportunity. And, what potential do you believe you possess, human? The guard's tone was amused now.
Your species has no natural weapons, no enhanced physical capabilities, no telepathic abilities, no manipulation of fundamental forces. You are, by galactic standards, remarkably unremarkable. They stopped at a processing station where a Vorthan technician waited with a scanner array. Marcus recognized the setup from his intelligence briefings. Full-spectrum biological analysis, psychological evaluation, threat assessment, cellular-level examination. They were going to take him apart and catalog every piece. You're not wrong, Marcus admitted as the Vorthan began its scans. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. We don't have built-in weapons or the ability to phase through matter or natural armor. Hell, we can barely survive on our own planet without tools. The scanners hummed and clicked around him. He could feel them probing, measuring, analyzing. The Vorthan's bioluminescent patterns shifted through what he assumed were expressions of puzzlement. Apparently, humans were as confusing biologically as they were culturally.
But, here's the thing about humans, Marcus continued.
We're really good at one particular thing. Something that apparently no other species in the galaxy has quite figured out how to do properly.
And, what might that be?
The lead guard was clearly entertaining himself now, probably planning to share this conversation with his colleagues later. Marcus watched the Vorthan technician's patterns shift to what looked like alarm.
The scanners were telling it things that didn't make sense according to established xenobiological principles.
Human neural architecture was simultaneously more primitive and more complex than anything in the databases.
Human physiology was riddled with apparent contradictions. Human psychology was unpredictable.
We adapt, Marcus said simply.
Put us in a new environment, we figure out how to survive there. Give us a problem that should be impossible to solve, we find a way around it. Lock us up in the most secure prison in the galaxy.
He smiled at the guard, the expression lost on the alien's compound eyes but perfectly clear in his tone. Well, let's just say that tends to work out poorly for the people doing the locking. The Vorthan completed its scans and transmitted the results to the lead guard's datapad.
Marcus watched the HFY's eyes flicker as it read.
He could practically see the moment when the guard realized that none of the threat assessment protocols had any idea what to do with a human. Concerning, the guard muttered, then, louder, the human will be placed in standard isolation pending further analysis. As they moved deeper into the facility, Marcus began his real work.
Not escape, not yet. First came understanding.
Every prison had a rhythm, a set of rules and procedures and habits that kept it functioning. The guards had schedules, the prisoners had routines, the facility itself had operational patterns. Before he could exploit any weaknesses, he had to map the system entirely. The isolation cells were exactly what he'd expected. A cube of some impossibly hard alien metal, 10 feet on each side, with a force field for a door and basic life support systems. No windows, no decorations, nothing to stimulate the mind or provide distraction. It was designed to break the will of creatures accustomed to stimulus and activity. Marcus settled onto the simple cot and closed his eyes. The neural dampeners were still active, still making coherent thought difficult.
But that was fine.
He'd learned meditation techniques from Zen masters, concentration exercises from Tibetan monks, and mental discipline practices from a dozen different human traditions. Aliens might have superior technology and natural advantages, but they'd never had to develop the psychological tools that humans used to cope with being the weakest species on a planet full of predators.
The first thing was to establish a baseline. How often did guards check on him? What were their shift patterns? How much observation was automated versus manual? What were the blind spots in the surveillance system? Over the next few days, Marcus learned the rhythm of HFY. Guards checked isolation cells every 4 hours during the primary shift, every 6 during the secondary shift. The surveillance system was primarily automated but included random manual verification every 2 to 8 hours. The cells were monitored by motion sensors, thermal detectors, and electromagnetic field analyzers, but all of these systems were calibrated for known alien physiologies. Human body temperature ran slightly higher than the galactic average. Human electromagnetic signatures were unique due to their unusual neural architecture. Human motion patterns didn't match any existing databases. In trying to be comprehensive, the monitoring system had created gaps that a human could potentially exploit. But the real opportunity came from an unexpected source. On his 5th day in isolation, Marcus was visited by a Vorthan psychiatrist named Dr. Viridian. The creature floated into his cell in its personal gravity field, bioluminescent patterns cycling through what Marcus had learned were expressions of clinical interest. "I am here to conduct a psychological evaluation," Dr. Viridian announced, its voice coming from a translation device since Vorthan communicated primarily through biochemical signals. "Your species presents several anomalies that require further study."
Marcus sat up on his cot, arranging his expression into one of respectful cooperation.
"Happy to help, Doc. Though I have to warn you, human psychology is complicated. All sentient psychology is complicated. However, humans appear to violate several established principles of cognitive development.
Your species shows evidence of multiple overlapping consciousness patterns, contradictory neural architectures, and psychological adaptability that should not be possible given your apparent evolutionary constraints."
"That's us," Marcus agreed cheerfully. "We're very good at being impossible."
Dr. Viridian's patterns shifted to what might have been amusement. "Perhaps.
Tell me, what drives you? What motivates a human to commit actions that your species surely understands will result in capture and imprisonment?"
Marcus considered the question seriously. It was a good one, and deserved a real answer.
"Do you know what happened when humans first looked up at the stars, Doctor?"
"I assume you observed celestial bodies and developed primitive astronomical theories, as most species do during early development."
"We did that too. But the important thing is what we felt when we looked up there."
Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone he'd once used to brief special forces teams. "We felt homesick for places we'd never been. We looked at points of light millions of miles away and thought, someday, I'm going to go there."
Dr. Viridian's patterns cycled through something Marcus couldn't interpret.
"That is unusual. Most species develop interstellar ambitions only after achieving significant technological advancement. Most species are smart enough to understand that something is impossible before they try it," Marcus replied.
"Humans are too stubborn to let a little thing like impossibility stop us. Do you want to know why I hacked the consortium's financial network? Please explain."
Marcus stood and began pacing the small cell, his movements carefully calculated to appear restless rather than purposeful. In reality, he was testing the response patterns of the monitoring systems, noting the microsecond delays in tracking and the blind spots created by the sensor placement.
"Because nobody told me I couldn't," he said simply. "Everyone assumed that quantum encryption was unbreakable."
The consortium had the best digital security experts from 100 different species working on their systems. Their encryption algorithms were based on mathematical principles that should have been impossible to circumvent without quantum computers the size of planets.
"And yet you succeeded."
I succeeded because I didn't try to break the encryption.
I went around it.
Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at the Vorthan.
Human intelligence isn't the most powerful in the galaxy. But it might be the most flexible. We don't solve problems the way they're supposed to be solved. We solve them the way that works.
Dr. Viridian was quiet for a long moment, its bioluminescent patterns cycling through complex configurations that Marcus suspected indicated deep thought.
Finally, it spoke again. What do you believe will happen to you here?
Marcus smiled, and, for the first time since arriving at Kethvar, he let a little bit of genuine emotion show through.
Honestly, Doctor? I think you're going to be very surprised.
After Dr. Viridian left, Marcus lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling. The conversation had served multiple purposes. It had given him insight into how the facility's staff viewed humans, it had allowed him to test the monitoring systems more thoroughly, and it had planted a seed of doubt in at least one alien mind about whether keeping him here was a good idea. But, most importantly, it had reminded him why he was here. Not because he'd been caught, but because he'd chosen to be caught. The consortium's financial network hack had been successful beyond his wildest expectations, but it had also been a proof of concept.
A demonstration that human ingenuity could overcome alien technology when properly applied. Now came the real test. Could one human, armed with nothing but creativity and stubbornness, escape from the most secure prison facility in the galaxy?
Marcus closed his eyes and began to plan. In his mind, he constructed a three-dimensional map of everything he'd observed about Kethvar. Guard patterns, system vulnerabilities, architectural details, operational procedures. He identified 17 different potential escape routes, calculated the probability of success for each, and began developing contingency plans. The aliens thought they were keeping him contained. They had no idea that they'd just given him the most comprehensive intelligence briefing on galactic security systems that any human had ever received. And Marcus Chin had always been a very quick learner. 3 weeks into his stay at Kethvar, Marcus had learned something that no alien in the facility suspected: the prison wasn't actually designed to hold prisoners. It was designed to contain them. The distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Containment meant keeping something dangerous from getting out. It required massive walls, overwhelming force, and constant vigilance. But holding someone implied that escape was possible, which meant security had to account for creativity, planning, and the kind of lateral thinking that turned weaknesses into opportunities. The Kethvari had built their facility around the first principle and ignored the second entirely. Marcus discovered this during his daily exercise period, which took place in a gymnasium the size of an aircraft hangar. The space was designed to accommodate dozens of species with wildly different physical requirements. Fenari pack runners needed space to achieve their remarkable speeds. Terralian prisoners required reinforced equipment to handle their massive bulk. Vorthan inmates floated through obstacle courses that challenged their three-dimensional movement capabilities. For Marcus, they'd provided basic human exercise equipment that looked like it had been designed by aliens who'd read a description of a gym but had never actually seen one. The weights were the wrong shape, the running track was banked for species with different leg configurations, and the resistance machines were calibrated for strength levels that assumed all bipedal creatures were roughly equivalent. But what fascinated Marcus wasn't the equipment. It was the other prisoners. Kethvar housed approximately 300 inmates from across the galaxy, representing 47 different species. Each one was here because they'd been classified as a maximum security threat to galactic civilization. These weren't common criminals or political dissidents. These were the beings that other beings had nightmares about. And they were all watching him. Marcus had noticed the attention from the beginning, but it took him time to understand what he was seeing. Aliens communicated in ways that humans barely comprehended. The Vorthan exchanged complex biochemical signals that could convey information equivalent to hours of conversation in seconds. The Fenari used pack telepathy that linked their minds in ways that made individual consciousness almost meaningless. The Nethic communicated through harmonic vibrations that could carry emotional and conceptual information across vast distances. But, regardless of their methods, they were all talking about the same thing: the human who didn't belong. The breakthrough came during his 4th week, when Marcus encountered another prisoner during his exercise period. Torven was a Nethic assassin who had been convicted of eliminating an entire planetary government using nothing but precisely controlled phase shifts that had collapsed 3 major buildings simultaneously. According to his file, which Marcus had memorized from his intelligence briefings, Torven was considered one of the most dangerous individuals in known space. He was also, Marcus realized, desperately bored. Human, Torven said, his translated voice carrying harmonics that suggested curiosity mixed with predatory interest. You puzzle the facility staff. Marcus looked up from the improvised exercise routine he'd developed. The Nethic stood 7 feet tall, his body seeming to flicker between solid and translucent as his phase-shifting abilities operated on an unconscious level. His species had evolved on a world where matter existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously, giving them the ability to move through solid objects at will.
Do I? I thought I was being a model prisoner.
Torven's laugh was like the sound of crystal breaking in slow motion.
Model prisoners do not cause security protocols to be rewritten every few days.
Model prisoners do not require specialized monitoring equipment. Model prisoners do not make the guards nervous. Marcus set down the improvised weights he'd been using and gave the Nethic his full attention.
This conversation was important, though he wasn't yet sure why. What exactly have you heard? That human physiology confuses the medical staff.
That human psychology violates established behavioral prediction models. That human technology operates on principles that no one understands. Torven moved closer, his form becoming more solid as his concentration focused. But, most interesting of all, that humans are apparently incapable of accepting that certain things are impossible.
That's true, Marcus admitted. We're really bad at giving up. Show me.
The challenge was simple and direct, the kind of test that Marcus recognized from a dozen different first contact scenarios. Torven wanted to understand what made humans different, and he was offering Marcus an opportunity to demonstrate. Marcus looked around the gymnasium, noting the positions of the guards and the other prisoners.
16 Kethvari guards maintained watch from elevated positions around the perimeter.
Security sensors tracked every movement in the space. The other inmates were scattered throughout the area, some exercising, others simply observing.
What would you like me to show you?
Torven gestured toward a section of the gymnasium where a massive Terralian was working with weights that probably massed more than Marcus's entire body.
Korvax is the strongest prisoner in this facility.
His species evolved as apex predators on a world with 3 times standard gravity. He could crush your skull with one hand without effort.
Marcus studied the Terralian.
Korvax stood nearly 12 feet tall, his elephant-like body covered in natural armor plating that could probably stop military-grade energy weapons. His 3 trunks moved independently as he manipulated equipment that required the coordination of multiple limbs. By any reasonable measure, he was absolutely right that the creature could kill Marcus without breaking a sweat.
Okay, Marcus said. What's your point?
Challenge him to a contest of strength.
Marcus looked at Torven, then, back at Korvax, then, started laughing. The sound echoed through the gymnasium, causing several aliens to turn and stare.
He laughed until tears ran down his cheeks, until his ribs hurt, until he had to sit down on a nearby bench.
You want me to challenge a 12-foot-tall armored elephant to an arm wrestling match?
Yes.
That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Torven's form flickered with what Marcus was beginning to recognize as Nethic amusement.
Precisely. No rational being would attempt such a thing.
It violates every principle of strategic thinking. It ignores all evidence about probable outcomes. It is, as you say, stupid. Marcus wiped his eyes and stood up. And you think I'm going to do it anyway? I think you are human.
And humans, according to the facility staff, do not allow probability to determine their actions.
Marcus considered this.
The challenge was obviously impossible. Korvax outmassed him by a factor of 10 and possessed strength that was literally superhuman by several orders of magnitude.
Any contest of raw power would end with Marcus being crushed into paste. But Torven was right about one thing: humans didn't let probability determine their actions.
They let creativity determine their actions.
All right, Marcus said, standing up and walking toward Korvax. But we're not doing this the way you expect. The Terralian noticed Marcus's approach long before he arrived. Creatures that evolved as apex predators didn't survive by ignoring potential threats, even small ones. Korvax set down the massive weights he'd been manipulating and turned to face Marcus with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was trying to determine whether the human represented danger, food, or entertainment. Human, Korvax rumbled, his voice carrying subsonic frequencies that made Marcus's chest vibrate. You approach without fear. This suggests either courage or ignorance. Probably both, Marcus admitted. I wanted to ask you something. Are you familiar with human concepts of competition? Korvax's three trunks moved in patterns that Marcus assumed indicated thought. Competition is universal. Creatures compete for resources, territory, mates, dominance. Your species is not unique in this regard. True. But humans have developed some unusual variations on the theme. Marcus gestured toward the weights that Korvax had been using. For instance, we've created competitions where the goal isn't to demonstrate absolute capability, but to demonstrate relative improvement or creative problem solving. Explain. Marcus had the attention of not just Korvax now, but several other prisoners and even some of the guards. Conversations in alien languages were being translated and retranslated as word spread through the gymnasium that the human was about to do something interesting. I can't beat you in any contest of strength, Marcus said honestly. You're bigger, stronger, and tougher than me by margins that make comparison ridiculous. But what if we had a different kind of contest? What if we competed to see who could find the most creative solution to a physical problem? Korvax considered this, his massive head tilting in a gesture that was probably analogous to a human frown. What manner of problem? Marcus looked around the gymnasium, noting the equipment, the layout, the physical constraints of the space. An idea began forming in his mind, the kind of lateral thinking that had made him effective in intelligence work. That support beam up there, he said, pointing toward the ceiling where a massive structural element ran the length of the gymnasium. What would it take to touch it? The beam in question was approximately 40 feet above the floor. For most species in the facility, reaching it would require specialized equipment or natural abilities like flight. For Korvax, with his massive size and strength, it might be possible to stack enough gym equipment to create a platform tall enough to reach. An interesting challenge, Korvax admitted. But the guards would not permit us to disassemble the gymnasium. Then, we have to find another way. Marcus turned to address the growing crowd of prisoners who had gathered to watch. Anyone else want to make this interesting? What followed was unlike anything the guards at Kethvar had ever witnessed. Within minutes, Marcus had turned a simple physical challenge into a complex problem-solving exercise that involved multiple species working together to find creative solutions. The Vorthan prisoners, with their natural ability to manipulate gravity, could theoretically reach the beam by floating upward. But their personal gravity fields were individually weak and couldn't support additional mass. However, working together, multiple Vorthan could create overlapping fields strong enough to lift a small object. The Fenari packrunners, with their enhanced speed and agility, could potentially run up the walls if they achieved sufficient velocity. But the walls were smooth and provided no grip for their claws. However, if someone could provide temporary handholds, the Nethic prisoners could phase through solid matter, but couldn't phase through energy fields. The gymnasium's ceiling included force field generators that would prevent them from simply phasing through to the structural space above. However, if those generators could be temporarily overloaded. Marcus watched the aliens work through the problem, each species contributing their unique capabilities while working around their limitations. It was like watching a massive, three-dimensional puzzle solve itself through cooperative intelligence. And the guards, he noticed, were so fascinated by the display that they'd stopped maintaining proper security protocols. Humans are teachers, Torven observed, appearing beside Marcus with the unsettling suddenness that phase shifting allowed. You have turned a simple physical contest into a lesson in collaboration. Not a teacher, Marcus corrected, watching as a group of Terralian prisoners began working with Fenari packrunners to create a living ladder system. An organizer. Humans are really good at seeing how different capabilities can work together to solve problems. And, what problem are you actually solving, human?
Marcus smiled, noting that the guards had moved closer to get a better view of the prisoners' activities. The entire facility's attention was now focused on the gymnasium, where dozens of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals were working together like an efficient engineering team. "The same problem I've been working on since I got here," Marcus said quietly. "How to turn individual weaknesses into collective strength." The solution, when it came, was elegant in its complexity. The Vorthan created overlapping gravity fields to lift a Fenari packrunner, who used their enhanced agility to attach handholds that the Nethek had phase-shifted into temporary solidity. The Terralians provided the structural support and coordination, while smaller species served as liaison and communication links between groups. Within an hour, they had created a functional system that allowed any prisoner in the gymnasium to reach the support beam 40 feet above the floor. The guards were so impressed that they didn't notice Marcus slipping away during the celebration that followed. He had exactly 17 minutes before the next security sweep, and he'd just learned something that fundamentally changed his understanding of Kethvar. The prisoners weren't just being contained here. They were being isolated, kept apart not just from the outside galaxy but from each other. The facility's security model depended on the assumption that these individuals would never cooperate, never combine their abilities, never work together toward common goals. But Marcus had just proven that assumption wrong. And if the prisoners could work together to solve a simple physical problem, they could work together to solve much more complex ones. Like escape. Marcus made his way through the corridors toward his cell, moving with the casual confidence of someone who belonged exactly where they were. The key to moving undetected in any secure facility was to act like you had every right to be there. Guards were trained to look for suspicious behavior, not confident normalcy. As he walked, he mentally catalogued everything he'd learned. The capabilities of 47 different alien species. The security protocols that governed prisoner movement. The staff schedules and surveillance patterns. The physical layout of the facility and its structural weaknesses. But, most importantly, he'd learned that the galaxy's most dangerous criminals were just people. Incredibly powerful people with abilities that could reshape reality itself, but still fundamentally individuals who could be motivated, organized, and led toward common goals. The neural dampeners were still active, still making coherent thought difficult. But Marcus had discovered something the facility's designers had never considered: human neural architecture was naturally resistant to certain types of interference. The dampeners could slow his thinking, but they couldn't stop him from thinking differently. And thinking differently, Marcus was beginning to realize, was the most dangerous ability a human could possess. When he reached his cell, Marcus lay down on his cot and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, new chances to turn the facility's assumptions against itself. He was no longer just a prisoner waiting for rescue. He was a teacher in a school full of very talented students. And the curriculum was going to be escape. The first rule of prison escape, Marcus had learned from studying historical cases across dozens of species, was that you never escaped alone. The second rule was that you never trusted anyone completely. The third rule was that successful escapes required months or years of careful preparation. Marcus decided to break all three rules simultaneously. 6 weeks after his arrival at Kethvar, he'd identified the 12 most strategically valuable prisoners in the facility and had begun what he privately called recruitment operations. The process was delicate, requiring him to approach each individual in a way that appealed to their specific psychology while building toward a coordinated effort that none of them fully understood. The key was making each alien believe that cooperation was their idea. HFY was his first real convert, though the Vorthan psych specialist probably didn't realize it. Marcus had encountered her during a mandatory educational session designed to keep prisoners mentally occupied. The facility's staff had established these programs after determining that idle minds were more likely to develop escape plans, though Marcus suspected they'd never considered that educational sessions might actually facilitate escape planning. HFY had been convicted of using her species' natural empathic abilities to manipulate the emotional states of an entire planetary population, essentially turning 5 billion sentient beings into puppets for her personal entertainment. She was, according to her psychological profile, a textbook sociopath with no capacity for genuine emotional connection.
Marcus approached her anyway.
The human studies ancient warfare, HFY observed as Marcus settled beside her in the educational center. Her translator rendered her biochemical communications as precise, emotionless English, but Marcus could see the bioluminescent patterns that provided the real content of Vorthan speech. Military history, Marcus confirmed, gesturing toward the holographic display he'd been examining. Specifically, siege warfare and defensive strategies.
I find it relaxing.
HFY's patterns shifted to what Marcus had learned indicated curiosity mixed with predatory interest.
Relaxing to study violence?
Relaxing to study problem solving, Marcus corrected. Every siege is essentially a puzzle. You have defenders with certain advantages and attackers with different advantages. The outcome depends on who can most effectively leverage their strengths while exploiting their opponent's weaknesses.
And what conclusions have you drawn from your studies?
Marcus smiled, noting that several other prisoners had moved close enough to overhear their conversation. Word traveled fast in HFY, and, by now most inmates were aware that conversations with the human tended to be educational. That the most effective sieges aren't won through direct assault or superior firepower.
They're won by turning the defender's own systems against them.
HFY's bioluminescent patterns cycle through configurations that Marcus couldn't interpret, but her body language suggested intense focus.
Explain.
Marcus called up a specific historical example on the holographic display.
The Siege of Constantinople in human year 1453.
The Byzantine defenders had massive walls, superior position, and technological advantages. The Ottoman attackers had larger numbers but inferior equipment. By conventional analysis, the siege should have failed.
But it succeeded.
It succeeded because the attackers found ways to make the city's defenses work against the defenders. They used the defenders' own cannon against them by redirecting artillery fire. They exploited the defenders' communication systems to spread misinformation. They turned the defenders' confidence in their walls into complacency that prevented effective response to new tactics. Marcus paused, letting the implications settle.
Around them, other prisoners were listening with the kind of attention that suggested they understood he wasn't just discussing ancient history.
The lesson, Marcus continued, is that the strongest defensive positions are often the most vulnerable, because they encourage dependency on systems rather than adaptability to circumstances. HFY was quiet for a long moment, her patterns cycling through complex configurations.
An interesting perspective.
But surely you realize that such historical examples have limited relevance to current circumstances.
Do they?
Marcus looked around the educational center, noting the surveillance equipment, the guard positions, the facility's security measures.
I don't know. This place seems like a pretty impressive fortress to me.
That night, Marcus was visited by Dr. Viridian for another psychological evaluation. The Vorthan psychiatrist seemed more agitated than usual, its bioluminescent patterns flickering with what Marcus had learned to recognize as professional concern. Your integration with the general prisoner population has proceeded more rapidly than anticipated, Dr. Viridian announced without preamble. The facility staff has noted unusual behavioral changes among inmates who have interacted with you.
What kind of changes? Increased cooperation. Enhanced problem-solving behavior.
Reduced aggression between different species groups. The prisoners are beginning to function as a cohesive social unit rather than isolated individuals.
Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting. Do you think that's a bad thing? It is, unexpected.
Prison populations across the galaxy typically exhibit high levels of internal conflict and competition. The HFY facility was designed around this assumption. Our security protocols depend on prisoners remaining antagonistic toward each other.
Ah. Marcus leaned back on his cot, arranging his expression into one of innocent curiosity. So you're saying that the prison's security model stops working if the prisoners start getting along?
Dr. Viridian's pattern shifted to what might have been alarm.
That is an oversimplification of a complex issue. But not an inaccurate one?
The psychiatrist was quiet for a moment, its patterns cycling through configurations that Marcus suspected indicated internal conflict.
Finally, it spoke again. "What are you attempting to accomplish here, human?"
Marcus considered the question seriously. Dr. Viridian had been the most honest of his interrogators, and deserved an honest answer in return. "I'm trying to understand what makes people work together instead of against each other," he said finally.
Humans have always been fascinated by cooperation, probably because we're not naturally very good at it.
We have to work at it. But, when we do manage to cooperate effectively, we can accomplish things that should be impossible.
And, you believe you can teach this to the prisoners here?
I don't think I need to teach it. I think most species already know how to cooperate. They just need someone to remind them that it's possible.
After Dr. Viridian left, Marcus lay in his cell and reviewed his progress.
6 weeks of careful social engineering had achieved more than he dared hope. The prison's rigid hierarchy was beginning to break down as prisoners from different species found common ground. Guard protocols were becoming less effective as inmates stopped behaving in predictable ways. Most importantly, a dozen of the facility's most dangerous criminals were beginning to think of themselves as part of a group rather than as isolated individuals. But, the real breakthrough came during his 7th week, when Marcus encountered a problem he couldn't solve alone. The facility's central computer system was protected by quantum encryption that made his previous hack of the consortium's financial network look like a child's puzzle.
The processing power required to break the encryption would need computers the size of small moons. The mathematical principles involved were based on physics that humanity was still decades away from understanding. By any rational analysis, accessing the system was absolutely impossible. Marcus decided to stop being rational. The breakthrough came when he realized that he didn't need to break the encryption. He needed to convince the computer that he had authorization to access the system. And, the only beings with that level of authorization were the facility's senior staff. Specifically, the facility's commanding officer, Warden Kethvar himself. Marcus had studied the warden's psychological profile during his first week. Kethvar was a career military officer who had spent 3 centuries building his reputation as the galaxy's most effective prison administrator. His facility had never experienced a successful escape attempt. His security protocols were studied and copied by law enforcement agencies across known space. His personal honor was inextricably linked to his professional success. Which meant that the warden's greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability. Marcus began his final phase of preparation by requesting a personal meeting with Warden Kethvar. The request was denied, as expected. He requested again, providing a detailed explanation of why the meeting was necessary for facility security. The request was denied again. He submitted a formal complaint through the facility's prisoner advocacy system, arguing that denial of access to senior staff violated galactic detention standards. The third denial came with a personal message from the warden himself: the human prisoner will remain in isolation indefinitely. No further requests will be considered. Marcus smiled when he read the message. The warden had just made his first mistake. The next day, during the exercise period, Marcus gathered his carefully recruited team around him in the gymnasium. 12 prisoners from 7 different species, each one chosen for specific capabilities that complemented the others. They looked like a diverse collection of dangerous individuals who happened to be in the same place at the same time. What they actually represented was the most formidable combination of talents ever assembled in a single location. "I have a proposition for everyone," Marcus announced quietly. "How would you feel about taking a field trip?" Torven flickered into partial solidity, his phase-shifting abilities allowing him to appear suddenly beside Marcus. "Field trip?" "An educational excursion.
A chance to see parts of this facility that aren't normally included in the prisoner experience." Marcus paused, noting that he had everyone's complete attention. Specifically, the command center. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of tension that suggested multiple species were simultaneously calculating probabilities and risk factors. Zephai's bioluminescent patterns cycled through configurations that probably indicated either excitement or terror. Korvax's massive frame shifted in ways that suggested he was restraining himself from either attacking or fleeing.
Human, rumbled a voice from behind him.
Marcus turned to see Vexthal, a Terralian strategist who had been convicted of orchestrating a three-system war that had lasted 40 years.
Are you suggesting what I believe you are suggesting?
I'm suggesting that we've all learned a lot during our time here, Marcus replied carefully. About the facility, about each other, about what's possible when different capabilities work together. And I'm suggesting that it might be time to apply that education to a practical problem.
Prison escape, Torvin said bluntly. Academic exercise, Marcus corrected.
A test of whether our collaborative problem-solving methods are effective in real-world applications. HFY's pattern shifted to what Marcus had learned indicated cynical amusement.
An academic exercise that results in us leaving this facility. Potentially. Vexthal leaned forward, his massive frame making the floor vibrate. And, why should we trust you, human? What assurance do we have that this is not some elaborate scheme to benefit only yourself?
It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had expected.
Trust was always the weakest link in any collaborative effort, particularly when the collaborators were individuals whose primary talents involved betraying trust. You shouldn't trust me, Marcus said honestly.
You should trust yourselves.
Every one of you is here because you're exceptionally good at what you do. You've all survived in environments that should have killed you. You've all accomplished things that other people said were impossible.
The only reason you're prisoners instead of conquerors is because you've been isolated, cut off from the kinds of resources and support that would make you truly dangerous. He gestured around the gymnasium, where dozens of other prisoners were engaged in their daily activities.
But, you're not isolated anymore.
For the first time in your lives, you're surrounded by beings who are as capable and as determined as you are.
The question isn't whether you should trust me. The question is whether you're brave enough to trust each other. The discussion that followed lasted 3 hours and involved the most complex multilingual negotiation that Marcus had ever witnessed.
12 different species debated strategy, logistics, risk assessment, and resource allocation using communication methods that ranged from biochemical signals to harmonic vibrations to direct telepathic contact. By the end of it, Marcus had learned something remarkable about galactic civilization. When the most dangerous individuals from different species worked together, they were capable of planning and coordination that surpassed anything human military strategists had ever achieved. They were also capable of brutally efficient honesty about probable outcomes. The plan has an approximately a 7% chance of success, Vexthal concluded after analyzing every aspect of the proposal. The most likely outcome is that we will all be killed during the attempt. 7% is better than 0%, Marcus replied. And 0% is what we have if we stay here indefinitely. HFY's patterns flickered with what might have been laughter. The human is correct. We are already dead. We simply have not yet stopped breathing. Torven's form solidified completely, indicating his full commitment to the discussion. When do we begin? Marcus looked around at the group of aliens who had just agreed to risk everything based on his belief that impossible things were simply things that nobody had figured out how to do yet. Tomorrow night, he said. During the secondary shift change, when the guard rotation creates a 15-minute gap in corridor surveillance. As the group dispersed, Marcus felt a familiar mixture of excitement and terror that he recognized from his years in intelligence work. He was about to attempt something that every expert in the galaxy would consider absolutely impossible. Which meant that it was exactly the kind of challenge that humans were designed to handle. The only question was whether he'd taught his alien classmates enough about human stubbornness to make the impossible merely improbable. He was about to find out. The escape began at 23:47 station time, when the secondary shift guards reported to their posts and discovered that 17 surveillance drones had mysteriously developed technical malfunctions over the previous 8 hours. By 23:52, emergency maintenance teams were scrambling to restore coverage to critical facility areas. By 23:58, they realized that the malfunctions weren't random technical failures. By midnight, they understood that Kethvar was under attack from the inside. Marcus had spent 2 months studying the facility's operational rhythm, and he'd identified the crucial weakness in their security model, the assumption that prisoners were reactive rather than proactive. Every protocol, every procedure, every contingency plan was built around responding to threats rather than preventing them. The guards were trained to react to escape attempts, not to prevent them from beginning. Which meant that by the time anyone realized what was happening, Marcus and his team were already 3 steps ahead of the response. The first phase of the operation proceeded exactly as planned. HFY used her empathic abilities to manipulate the emotional states of the night shift guards, creating subtle feelings of complacency and distraction that made them less likely to notice minor irregularities. Torven phase shifted through the facility's walls to disable surveillance equipment in areas that couldn't be reached through normal corridors. Vexthal used his strategic expertise to coordinate timing and ensure that each action occurred at precisely the right moment. The other 9 members of the team handled specialized tasks that Marcus had assigned based on their unique capabilities. The Fenari pack runners created diversions in distant parts of the facility to draw guard attention away from critical areas. The remaining Vorthan prisoners worked together to create gravity fields that allowed the team to reach areas that should have been inaccessible. The Nethic assassins used their harmonic communication abilities to coordinate activities across the entire facility without using the monitored communication systems.
But the real key to the operation's success was something that no alien species had ever developed: human-style improvisation.
Marcus had learned, during his years in intelligence work, that no plan survived contact with reality. Military strategists from every species in the galaxy understood this principle intellectually, but humans had turned it into an art form. They built adaptability into their planning process, creating frameworks flexible enough to accommodate unexpected developments while maintaining focus on core objectives. The first major improvisation occurred when they reached the command center and discovered that Warden Kethvar was still at his post despite being 12 hours into what should have been his rest period. Complication, Torven announced as his phase-shifted reconnaissance revealed the unexpected presence. The primary target is in the operational center. Marcus considered this development while the rest of the team waited for instructions. They were committed now, deep enough into the facility that retreat was no longer possible. The Warden's presence changed the tactical situation but didn't alter the fundamental objective. Actually, Marcus said after a moment of thought, that's perfect. HFY's bioluminescent pattern shifted to what Marcus had learned indicated confusion mixed with alarm. Perfect? The Warden's presence increases security by several orders of magnitude. The Warden's presence gives us something we couldn't get any other way, Marcus replied. Direct access to someone with unlimited authorization to modify facility systems. Vexthal's massive frame shifted as the Terralian strategist processed this information. You intend to capture the facility, Commander? I intend to convince him to help us. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of tension that suggested multiple species were questioning Marcus's sanity. Even Torven, whose phasing abilities made him effectively immune to most forms of retaliation, seemed to be reconsidering his commitment to the operation. Human, HFY said carefully, the Warden is not merely the facility commander. He is a decorated military officer with 3 centuries of experience. His personal combat capabilities exceed those of most entire security teams. His loyalty to galactic law enforcement is absolute. Under no circumstances would he cooperate with an escape attempt. Under normal circumstances, you'd be right, Marcus agreed. But these aren't normal circumstances. We're not just escaping from his facility. We're proving that his security model is fundamentally flawed. Marcus moved closer to the command center, noting the defensive positions and security measures that protected the facility's nerve center. The area was designed to withstand assault by beings with capabilities far exceeding anything humans could manage. Energy shields, automated defense systems, structural reinforcements that could resist the combined efforts of multiple species working together. But all of those defenses were designed to stop people from breaking in. None of them were designed to stop people from walking out. The Warden's greatest strength is his professional reputation, Marcus continued as the team gathered around him. For 3 centuries, he's built his identity around the fact that no one has ever escaped from Kethvar. His personal honor, his career advancement, his social status within galactic civilization, everything depends on maintaining that perfect record. Torven flickered into partial solidity. And, you believe this makes him vulnerable? I believe this makes him predictable. He can't allow us to escape, because our escape would destroy everything he's worked for. But, he also can't allow us to remain here indefinitely, because our presence has already begun destabilizing his facility in ways that threaten his operational effectiveness.
Marcus paused, watching the expressions on alien faces as they processed the implications.
So he has to find a third option. Something that removes us from his facility without admitting that we escaped. HFY's patterns cycled through configurations that Marcus couldn't interpret, but her body language suggested she was beginning to understand. You intend to offer him a solution that preserves his reputation while achieving our objectives.
Exactly.
We're going to make him an offer he can't refuse, not because we're threatening him, but because we're giving him exactly what he needs. The approach to the command center required the team to coordinate their abilities in ways that pushed the limits of what Marcus had thought possible. Torven phased through the outer defensive barriers to disable security systems from the inside. The Vorthan team members created overlapping gravity fields that allowed the others to move through areas designed to be impassable. HFY used her empathic abilities to influence the emotional states of the automated defense systems that included sentient components. But the real breakthrough came when they reached the inner chamber and, Marcus finally, came face to face with Warden Kethvar himself. The Kethvari commander was exactly what Marcus had expected from his psychological profile. Tall, imposing, with the kind of presence that came from centuries of absolute authority. His compound eyes tracked the team's movement with professional assessment, noting capabilities and potential threats with the efficiency of someone who had spent his entire career evaluating dangerous individuals. Human prisoner designation 77 Alpha, Warden Kethvar said in the clicking, chittering language of his species. You have violated approximately 47 facility regulations, compromised multiple security systems, and orchestrated the most sophisticated breach attempt in the history of this facility. Marcus stepped forward, noting that his team had automatically arranged themselves in defensive positions around the chamber's perimeter. They were ready for violence if necessary, but they were also ready to follow his lead if he chose a different approach. Warden Kethvar, Marcus replied formally.
Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I know how busy you must be with facility management duties.
The warden's compound eyes reflected the chamber's lighting in thousands of tiny rainbows as he processed this response.
You are treating this as a social interaction rather than a hostile breach.
I'm treating this as a professional consultation between colleagues who have a mutual problem to solve.
What manner of problem?
Marcus gestured toward his team, then, toward the command center's displays that showed the facility's current status. Multiple warning indicators were flashing as automated systems tried to cope with the unprecedented situation of a coordinated prisoner action. You have a facility designed to contain individual threats, but your current prisoner population includes beings who can function as a coordinated team. Your security protocols are based on assumptions about prisoner behavior that are no longer valid. Your operational model depends on isolation and competition among inmates, but we've just demonstrated that cooperation is possible.
Marcus paused, watching the warden's reactions.
In short, Warden, your prison doesn't work anymore. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of the facility's environmental systems and the occasional click of the warden's compound eyes as they tracked movement around the chamber.
Continue, Warden Kethvar said finally. The problem isn't that we've escaped, Marcus continued. The problem is that our escape has revealed fundamental flaws in galactic detention philosophy. You can recapture us, but that won't solve the underlying issue. Other prisoners in other facilities will eventually figure out what we've figured out. The current model of maximum security detention will become obsolete.
Marcus moved closer to the command console, noting that the warden made no move to stop him.
But what if, instead of trying to suppress this development, you became the person who figured out how to adapt to it? What if you pioneered a new model of galactic detention that accounted for the possibility of interspecies cooperation? You're suggesting that I allow you to escape in order to preserve my professional reputation?
I'm suggesting that you recognize us as test subjects in an experimental program designed to evaluate new security protocols. Marcus smiled, the expression probably lost on the warden's alien physiology but clear in his tone.
We're not escaping prisoners.
We're graduates of an advanced rehabilitation program that successfully demonstrated the possibility of peaceful cooperation between species that were previously considered incompatible. The warden was quiet for a long moment, his compound eyes cycling through what Marcus assumed were expressions of thought. Around the chamber, the displays continued flashing warnings as facility systems struggled to process the unprecedented situation.
Your proposal has merit, Warden Kethvar admitted finally.
But implementation would require significant modifications to existing protocols. Implementation would establish you as the most innovative detention specialist in galactic history, Marcus replied. The warden who solved the problem of interspecies cooperation in maximum security environments.
And, if I decline your proposal?
Marcus looked around the chamber, noting the positions of his team members and the facility's defensive systems. Then, you'll spend the next several hours trying to recapture 12 of the galaxy's most dangerous individuals who now know exactly how your security works and have already proven they can coordinate their efforts effectively.
Whereas if I accept your proposal?
Then, you'll spend the next several hours documenting the success of an experimental program that revolutionizes galactic detention methodology. The warden moved to his command console and began entering authorization codes that Marcus recognized from his intelligence training.
High-level facility modifications, the kind that required personal authorization from the commanding officer.
I am initiating experimental protocol designation Kethvar 7, the warden announced.
12 volunteer test subjects will be released from detention as part of an advanced interspecies cooperation study. Their release will be documented as successful completion of a rehabilitation program rather than as an escape attempt.
Marcus felt a combination of relief and amazement as he watched the facility's most secure doors beginning to cycle open.
Thank you, Warden. I think you've made the right choice.
Human, Warden Kethvar said as the team prepared to leave, answer one question for me.
How did you know I would agree to this arrangement?
Marcus paused at the chamber's exit, considering the question.
Because you're a professional, Warden.
And professionals understand that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to redefine what success looks like. As they made their way through the facility's corridors toward the docking bay, Marcus reflected on what they'd actually accomplished. They hadn't just escaped from the galaxy's most secure prison. They'd fundamentally changed how galactic civilization thought about the relationship between security and cooperation. More importantly, they'd proven that humans brought something unique to the galactic community, the ability to turn problems into opportunities. But, as they boarded the transport ship that would carry them away from Kethvar, Marcus realized that their real adventure was just beginning. They were no longer prisoners.
They were a team.
3 months after their departure from Kethvar, Marcus Chen found himself standing on the observation deck of a converted cargo freighter, watching 12 of the galaxy's most dangerous individuals work together to rebuild a dying world. The planet below them was HFY Prime, a former consortium manufacturing hub that had been abandoned after an industrial disaster contaminated most of its surface. The cleanup would take decades using conventional methods, cost more than the GDP of most star systems, and require coordination between technologies that multiple species had never successfully integrated. It was exactly the kind of impossible problem that Marcus had learned to love. The atmospheric processors are functioning at 93% efficiency, reported Vexthal from his position at the engineering station. The massive Terralian had proven to be as gifted at environmental restoration as he had been at military strategy. Toxin levels in the northern continent have decreased by 47% over the past week. Soil rehabilitation in Sector 7 is proceeding ahead of schedule, added Zephi, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through configurations that Marcus had learned indicated satisfaction. The Vorthan empath had discovered that her ability to manipulate emotional states extended to the bioremediation organisms they were using to clean contaminated Earth. Marcus nodded, reviewing the status displays that showed their progress across multiple fronts. What had started as a desperate search for somewhere to hide after their escape from Kethvar had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history, a multi-species restoration project that was succeeding where government agencies and corporate entities had failed. Incoming transmission from Galactic Council headquarters, announced Torven, materializing beside Marcus with the casual efficiency that phase shifting allowed.
Priority classification.
Marcus accepted the transmission, noting that his team continued their work without pause. Over the past 3 months, they'd learned to function as a unit in ways that surprised even him. 12 individuals who should have been natural enemies had become something approaching a family. The holographic display showed Counselor Terran, the Altarian diplomat who served as the galaxy's chief mediator for interspecies disputes. Her crystalline features reflected light in patterns that conveyed emotional information as clearly as spoken words.
Marcus Chen, Counselor Terran began without preamble.
The Galactic Council has been monitoring your activities since your departure from HFY. We need to discuss the implications of what you and your associates have accomplished.
Good morning to you too, Counselor, Marcus replied. I take it our work here has attracted some attention?
Your work has revolutionized our understanding of interspecies cooperation, Terran continued. The restoration of HFY Prime was deemed impossible by our best experts. Multiple species had attempted the project using their individual capabilities, and all had failed. Yet your team has achieved more progress in 3 months than government agencies managed in 3 years.
Marcus looked around the observation deck, where his teammates continued their coordination activities.
Torven was phase-shifting through the ship's hull to conduct maintenance on external sensors.
Korvax was using his massive strength to handle equipment that required multiple beings to operate safely.
The Fenari packrunners were managing communication relays across the planet's surface with their enhanced speed and natural coordination. We had good teachers, Marcus said honestly.
Every species in the galaxy has developed incredible capabilities.
The only thing we did was figure out how to combine those capabilities effectively.
That only thing has implications that extend far beyond environmental restoration, Terran replied.
The consortium's financial network hack that brought you to our attention, your escape from HFY, and now your success with HFY Prime have demonstrated something that galactic civilization has never seen before, a systematic approach to solving problems that were previously considered impossible. Marcus felt a familiar mixture of excitement and wariness.
In his experience, when governments started paying attention to successful operations, they usually wanted either to control them or eliminate them. What exactly are you proposing, Counselor?
The Galactic Council would like to offer your team official recognition and resources to continue your work on a larger scale.
There are dozens of worlds facing challenges that conventional approaches cannot address. Environmental disasters, technological failures, social conflicts that threaten entire species. Problems that require exactly the kind of innovative thinking you've demonstrated. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the offer.
Official recognition meant resources, support, and the ability to work on problems at a scale they could never achieve independently.
But it also meant oversight, bureaucracy, and the possibility that their methods would be constrained by political considerations. What would be the terms of this arrangement?
Complete operational autonomy in exchange for periodic reports and voluntary consultation on matters of galactic security, Terran replied. The Council would provide funding, resources, and legal protection. In return, your team would tackle challenges that individual governments cannot solve alone. Marcus looked around the observation deck again, noting that his teammates had stopped their work to listen. The conversation was being translated into multiple languages simultaneously, allowing everyone to follow the discussion. We'd need to discuss this as a group, Marcus said finally.
Decisions like this aren't mine to make alone.
Of course.
Please take all the time you need. But I should mention that there is some urgency to the matter. We have received reports of a developing situation that may require immediate attention. What kind of situation?
Terran's crystalline features shifted in patterns that Marcus had learned indicated serious concern.
A first contact scenario.
A previously unknown species has appeared in the Outer Rim territories. Their technology is advanced, their intentions are unclear, and initial diplomatic efforts have been unsuccessful. Marcus felt his team members' attention focus completely on the conversation. First contact situations were always delicate, requiring careful navigation between curiosity and caution. But, when Counselor Terran described the efforts as unsuccessful, it usually meant someone was shooting at someone else.
What makes this situation different from standard first contact protocols? Marcus asked. The new species appears to be human.
The silence that followed was filled with implications that Marcus was still processing when HFY moved beside him, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through configurations he'd never seen before. There are other humans in the galaxy, she asked, her translated voice carrying harmonics of confusion. Apparently so, Terran replied. Long-range scans indicate humanoid physiology consistent with Earth-descended populations. But, their technology is centuries ahead of anything in our databases, and they seem to be completely unaware of the existing galactic community. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle falling into place in his mind. Earth's first contact with galactic civilization had occurred only 15 years ago, but humanity had been launching exploration missions for decades before that. Colony ships, research expeditions, automated probes sent toward promising star systems. How long have they been in the outer rim? He asked. Unknown. They appeared suddenly, 3 weeks ago with a fleet of ships that materialized from what appears to be a previously unknown form of faster-than-light travel. They've established a presence in the Kepler 442 system and have been unresponsive to all communication attempts. Unresponsive or hostile? Both. They've destroyed several automated probes and disabled 2 consortium patrol ships that approached their position. No casualties yet, but the situation is escalating rapidly. Marcus looked around the observation deck, meeting the eyes of beings who had become more than teammates. They'd become something unprecedented in galactic history, a truly integrated multi-species community that could tackle problems no individual group could handle alone. Counselor, Marcus said after a moment, I think we're going to need a bigger ship. The discussion that followed lasted 6 hours and involved the most complex multilingual debate that Marcus had ever participated in. 12 species with vastly different perspectives on risk, diplomacy, and responsibility worked through the implications of accepting the Council's offer while simultaneously preparing for a mission that could determine the future relationship between humanity and galactic civilization. The debate was interrupted by an urgent transmission from the Kepler 442 system. Emergency broadcast from Consortium Fleet Command announced the ship's communication system. Unknown human vessels have begun aggressive expansion into neighboring systems. 3 colonies have been evacuated. Military response is being coordinated. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. Somewhere in the galaxy's outer territories, a group of humans was repeating the same pattern that had characterized their species' expansion across Earth: encounter, evaluate, and conquer. We need to get out there, Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that his team had learned to recognize. Now. Human, Vexthal rumbled from his position at the engineering station, we are not equipped for military operations against advanced human technology. We're not going there to fight them, Marcus replied, already moving toward the ship's command center. We're going there to talk to them. Torven materialized beside him, his phase-shifted form flickering with what Marcus had learned indicated concern. And, if they will not listen? Marcus paused at the command center's entrance, considering the question. The humans in the Kepler system had been isolated for decades, possibly centuries. They developed their own technology, their own culture, their own perspective on what humanity's role in the galaxy should be. They probably considered themselves the only representatives of their species in known space. Then, we'll have to show them what humans can become when they learn to work with others instead of against them, Marcus said finally. We'll have to prove that cooperation is stronger than conquest. As the ship's navigation systems calculated a course toward the Outer Rim territories, Marcus reflected on how far he'd come since his arrival at Kethvar. He'd entered the galaxy's most secure prison as a criminal who had challenged the established order. He was leaving as part of a team that might be the galaxy's best hope for preventing an interspecies war. The transformation hadn't been in his abilities or his knowledge. The transformation had been in his understanding of what was possible when different capabilities worked together toward common goals. Now he was about to find out if he could teach that lesson to humans who had spent decades learning the opposite. Course laid in for Kepler 442, reported Korvax from the navigation station. Estimated travel time, 72 hours at maximum acceleration. Make it 60, Marcus replied. And, send a message to Counselor Terran. Tell her we accept the Council's offer, effective immediately. As their ship accelerated toward its destination, Marcus stood on the observation deck and watched the stars shift from points of light to streaming lines. Somewhere ahead of them, humanity was about to meet humanity for the first time since leaving Earth. The question was whether the meeting would end in understanding or in war. But Marcus had learned something during his time at Kethvar, something that no prison could contain and no force could stop. When humans refused to accept that something was impossible, they had a way of making the impossible happen anyway. And, sometimes, the impossible thing was peace. He just hoped they'd have enough time to prove it. The human prisoner had become something the galaxy had never seen before, a teacher who could show even the most dangerous individuals how to transform their greatest weaknesses into their greatest strengths. Now it was time for the final lesson, how to teach that same transformation to the species that had sent him to the stars in the first place. The story was far from over. In fact, Marcus realized as he watched the stars streaming past, it was just beginning.